The sound had been scratching at the heavy oak doors of the estate for 3 hours. Not a threat, not a challenge, just the thin, rhythmic sound of a child crying. Kade poured a drink, his hand steady, waiting for the silence that usually followed his reputation. But the silence never came. He finally threw the door open, ready to unleash the kind of cold fury that kept a city in check. Instead, he froze. A little girl stood there, clutching a tattered teddy bear as if it were a shield. But it wasn't the bear that stopped his heart. It was her face, a ghost from a childhood he'd spent 20 years trying to bury. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling, "but they told me you were the only monster who could beat the others. Stay with me until the end, because when Kade realizes who sent this girl to his door, he's forced to start a war he promised himself he'd never fight." Kade Vane was a man built out of granite and secrets. His estate sat on the hill like a fortress, a monument to a man who had successfully cut himself off from the world. In Kade's world, there were no accidents, no emotions, and above all, no children. It was a cold Tuesday morning when the perimeter alarms stayed silent, but the air was filled with a sound Kade hadn't heard in decades. A child's sob. His security team watched the monitors, hands on their holsters, waiting for the order to clear the nuisance away. But Kade did something he never did. He walked to the door himself. He expected to find a beggar or a trap. He didn't expect to find Amari, a little girl who looked so much like the sister he lost that for one terrifying second, he thought he'd finally lost his mind. That single look was the first crack in the ice. And by the time the sun went down, the most detached man in the underworld would realize that to save this girl, he'd have to become the very thing he'd been running from. The heavy iron latch felt cold against Kade's palm, a stark contrast to the stifling humidity of the hallway. He had expected a courier or perhaps a neighbor complaining about the noise, but when the door creaked open, the air seemed to vanish from the room. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Standing in the dim amber light of the corridor was a girl who shouldn't exist. It wasn't just a passing similarity, it was a physical assault on his memory. The way the girl tilted her head, the specific arch of her brow, and the haunting depth of her dark eyes were a perfect, cruel mirror of his sister, Alina. For a heartbeat, the last 5 years disintegrated. The smell of hospital antiseptic and the silence of the funeral faded, replaced by the impossible reality of the girl before him. "Kade," she asked, her voice soft and tentative. The sound of his name snapped the tether. Alina's voice had been rhythmic and melodic. This girl's tone held a jagged edge of exhaustion. He gripped the doorframe until his knuckles turned white, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "Who are you?" He managed to grate out, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. She took a half step forward, into the spill of light from his apartment. "My name is Amari. I was told you were the only one left who would remember." Kade stared at her, his vision blurring for a moment. Up close, the resemblance was even more terrifying. She had the same small scar near her hairline from a childhood fall and the same habit of twisting a silver ring on her right hand. Every instinct told him to slam the door, to lock out the ghost that had come to haunt his doorstep. Yet, there was a desperation in her gaze that felt agonizingly human. He looked at her, searching for the trick, the lie, or the cruel twist of fate that had brought this face back to him. But the more he looked, the more the grief he had buried so carefully began to claw its way to the surface. She wasn't a ghost, but she was a reminder that some secrets refused to stay buried. "You look just like her," he whispered, the admission breaking the last of his composure. Amari didn't flinch. She simply watched him with those familiar, haunting eyes. "I know, that's why I'm here." Kade stood frozen in the doorway, the hallway's flickering light casting long, skeletal shadows behind Amari. He finally stepped back, a silent invitation born more from shock than hospitality. She entered the cramped apartment with a ghost's grace, her eyes darting toward the cluttered desk and the half-empty coffee mugs, searching for a safety that didn't exist. "You said you're here because of how you look," Kade said, his voice regaining some of its flinty edge. "Start talking." Amari didn't sit. She reached into the oversized pocket of her coat and pulled out a small, mangled teddy bear. Its fur was matted and stained a dull gray, one button eye hanging by. Precarious thread. Kade recognized it instantly. It was Agnes's favorite, a relic from a childhood that had been cut short by shadows. "The Blackie Mead crew came for us 3 nights ago," Amari whispered, her fingers trembling as they traced the bear's velvet ear. "They didn't knock. They didn't even use the door. They came through the windows like smoke." Kade felt a cold sweat prickle his neck. The Blackie Mead crew didn't just take people, they erased them. And Agnes, where is she? They took her, she said, the words catching in a jagged breath. The caregiver, Martha, she knew they were coming. She'd been terrified for weeks, whispering about debts and bloodlines I didn't understand. When the glass shattered, she shoved me into the crawl space behind the water heater. She told me to stay silent, no matter what I heard. Amari clutched the bear tighter to her chest, her knuckles as pale as Kade's had been. I watched through the vent. I saw them drag Agnes out. She wasn't fighting, she was vacant, like they'd already taken the soul out of her. Martha tried to stop them, tried to offer herself instead, but they just laughed. It was a game to them. She stepped closer to Kade, the resemblance to Alina flaring painfully in the dim light. Before they dragged Martha away, she threw this bear toward the crawl space. She yelled for me to run to the city to find the man who lost his sister twice. She said the bear was the only thing that mattered now. Kade reached out, his hand hovering over the toy. It's just a bear, Amari. No, she countered, her voice dropping to a fierce, low hum. She tilted the bear, feeling along the seam of its spine until she found a hard, unnatural lump beneath the stuffing. Martha didn't die to save a toy. She died to hide what's inside it. The silence that followed Amari's revelation was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against Kade's chest until he felt he might suffocate. He stared at the mangled teddy bear, but he wasn't seeing the matted fur or the missing button eye. He was seeing a rainy afternoon, 20 years ago. The smell of wet asphalt and the screech of tires that still echoed in the quietest parts of his mind. He remembered Alina's hand slipping from his, a small, frantic warmth that vanished in an instant. He had been 10 years old, told to keep her safe, told that a big brother was a shield. But shields break. He had stood on that curb, paralyzed by the sight of the black sedan speeding away, leaving nothing but a discarded red mitten in a puddle. The police had called it a random abduction. Kade had called it the end of the world. He had spent 2 decades trying to fill that silence with noise, work, and walls, only for this girl to stand in his living room and bring the ghosts back to life. Kade! Amari's voice was a soft blade, cutting through the fog of his memory. Martha said you were the only one who wouldn't turn away. She said you knew what it felt like to be left behind. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the tremor in her jaw she was trying so hard to hide. She wasn't just a resemblance. She was a second chance he didn't deserve. The Blackie Mead crew was a death sentence for anyone who crossed them, a shadow organization that fed on the vulnerable. If he stayed out of it, he might live a long, hollow life. If he helped her, he was stepping back into the nightmare that had claimed his sister. But the blood in his veins felt like liquid fire for the first time in years. The helplessness of that 10-year-old boy on the curb began to transmute into a cold, hard resolve. He had lost Alina because he was too small, too slow, and too afraid. He wasn't that boy anymore. Without a word, Kade reached out and took the bear from her hands. His fingers brushed against the hard lump hidden deep within the stuffing, a secret paid for in Martha's blood. He walked over to his kitchen counter and pulled a serrated folding knife from his pocket. The steel flickered in the low light. If we do this, Kade said, his voice low and steady, there's no going back. The Mead crew doesn't stop until they've taken everything. They already have, Amari replied. Kade nodded, the decision sealing like a tomb. He pressed the blade into the bear's seam. Then let's see what they're so afraid of. The neon sign of the bar across the street hummed, casting rhythmic pulses of blue light through the blinds of the back office. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale tobacco and the mounting heat of an argument. Kade leaned against the heavy oak desk, his expression a mask of cold stone as his lieutenants circled him like wolves sensing a lapse in judgment. You want us to pull the triggers on the Mead crew? Now. Elias, the eldest of the group, slammed a scarred hand onto the table. Kade, we've spent 3 years maintaining the border at the docks. We have a fragile peace that's padding everyone's pockets. You're talking about burning the city down over a caregiver and a missing girl. It's not just a girl, Kade said, his voice dangerously quiet. Then what is it? Jax, a younger man with nervous eyes and a hair-trigger temper, stepped forward. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've seen a ghost and lost your mind. We don't go to war for one old woman. Martha was a nobody. The Mead crew will chew us up and spit us out if we move on them without a tactical reason. The room tightened. Kade felt the weight of their gaze, the silent demand for logic in a situation that felt entirely visceral. He looked at the mangled teddy bear sitting on the desk, a silent witness to a crime they couldn't see. To them, it was an errand of mercy. To him, It was the final stand against a debt he had owed since he was 10 years old. The Meade crew took something they shouldn't have, Kade stated, straightening his posture. The authority in his voice was a physical pressure, forcing them to steady themselves. If they think they can snatch people from our streets without a response, then our fragile peace is already dead. We aren't just defenders of a border. We are the line they don't get to cross. This is suicide, Elias muttered, shaking his head. The men won't bleed for a stranger. Kade stepped into Elias' space, his eyes burning with a dark, focused intensity. They aren't bleeding for a stranger. They're bleeding for me. I'm calling in every favor, every debt, and every bullet we have. We hit their distribution hub at midnight. If you don't have the stomach for it, leave your keys on the desk and walk out now. Silence fell, absolute and suffocating. Jax looked at Elias, then back at Kade. The loyalty that had been forged in the trenches of the city's underworld held, though it frayed at the edges. One by one, they nodded, the grim realization of the coming slaughter settling over them. Kade watched them leave, his hand resting on the hidden lump within the bear. He wasn't just breaking a code, he was breaking the world to make it right. Should I reveal the contents of the hidden compartment now, or would you like to see the start of the midnight raid? The office door groaned on its hinges, but it wasn't a lieutenant returning for a final plea. A woman stepped into the blue-tinged shadows, her movements crisp and out of place in the grime of the back room. She wore a dark, pressed uniform, a private security detail for one of the city's upper-tier medical wings. Her face was etched with a grim professional resolve, but her eyes held a frantic, wet glint that betrayed her composure. "I heard the shouting," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "I'm the one who was on duty when they brought the girl in." Kade didn't move his hand from the hilt of his knife. "You're a long way from the hospital district." "Martha was my cousin," the woman replied, closing the distance between them. She reached into her pocket and produced a crumpled digital manifest, smoothed out by trembling fingers. "She called me 20 minutes before they took her. She didn't just hide a secret in a bear, Kade. She made sure someone was watching the GPS trackers the Meade crew uses for their inventory." She laid the paper on the desk over the mangled teddy bear. It wasn't just a list of names. It was a time-stamped log of a black site transport. Kade's eyes scanned the coordinates. They pointed away from the docks, away from the usual haunts of the Meade crew, toward an abandoned cold storage facility on the edge of the Iron District. "They aren't keeping her at the hub," the woman whispered, leaning over the map. "The Meade crew is moving their high-value assets to the old cannery. It's a fortress, Kade. They have scanners, thermal imaging, and a kill box at the only entrance. If you hit the hub like you told your men, you're just kicking a hornet's nest while they slip out the back door with Agnes." Kade studied the coordinates, the final piece of the jagged puzzle snapping into place. The lieutenants had been right. The hub would have been a slaughterhouse. A distraction designed to bleed him dry. Martha hadn't just died for a toy. She had died to buy them the timing they needed. "Why tell me this?" Kade asked, looking up at the woman. "You know what happens to anyone who helps me tonight." The woman adjusted her collar, her expression hardening into something resembling Kade's own cold fury. "They killed a woman who spent 40 years healing people. I don't care about the gangs or the borders anymore. I want them to burn." Kade looked at the manifest, then at the knife in his hand. The path was clear now, illuminated by the blood of the woman who had cared for those no one else wanted. He reached for his radio, his voice a low, gravelly growl that signaled the end of the wait. "Elias, Jax, change of plans. We aren't going to the hub. We're heading to the Iron District. And bring the heavy breaching rounds." The air in the Iron District tasted of salt and industrial rot. Kade moved through the shadows of the cannery's perimeter, his breath shallow and rhythmic, a predator's habit. Behind him, the muffled footfalls of his men were the only sound against the distant, rhythmic clanking of the harbor. They were a ghost fleet navigating a sea of concrete, hearts pounding in time with the flickering red beacons atop the warehouse. The cannery sat like a monolithic tomb at the end of the pier. As they reached the outer perimeter, Jax signaled the first guard. A silhouette slumped against a chain-link fence. There was no shout, only the wet thud of a body hitting the gravel and the sharp metallic snip of bolt cutters. The breach had begun. Inside, the atmosphere shifted from the cold bite of the night to a suffocating, artificial heat. Steam hissed from overhead pipes, obscuring the long aisles of rusting machinery. Kade led the way, his handgun raised, his thumb resting on the safety. Every shadow looked like a threat, Every drip of condensation sounded like a footstep. "Contact left," Elias hissed through the comms. The silence shattered. A roar of gunfire erupted from the mezzanine, tracers cutting lines of lethal light through the steam. Kade dove behind a heavy steel vat, the impact of bullets against the metal ringing in his ears like a funeral bell. He didn't wait for the dust to settle. He pivoted, firing 3 controlled rounds into the flash of a muzzle on the catwalk. A body plummeted, crashing into a stack of wooden crates with a sickening splintering sound. "Push forward," Kade roared over the chaos. "Don't let them pin us down." The Meade crew fought with the desperation of men who knew no mercy would be shown. The warehouse became a kaleidoscope of violence, the strobing of muzzle flashes, the scent of spent gunpowder, and the primal screams of the wounded. Kade moved with a singular, terrifying focus. He wasn't thinking about the lieutenant's protests or the fragile peace he had burned. He was thinking of the girl in the crawlspace and the red mitten in the puddle. He kicked through a heavy set of double doors leading toward the central offices, the kill box the uniformed woman had warned him about. Bullets shredded the drywall around him, showering his coat in white dust. He felt a sharp sting across his shoulder, a hot brand of lead, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't. At the end of the hall, a reinforced steel door stood between him and the center of the Meade's operation. Kade pulled a breaching charge from his vest, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He pressed the adhesive to the lock, his eyes reflecting the cold, unwavering light of the detonator. "Cover!" he shouted, diving back. The explosion was a physical wall of pressure that blew the door inward, leaving a gaping, blackened maw. Kade was the first through the smoke, his weapon leveled at the heart of the lion's den. The smoke from the breach curled around Kade's boots as he stepped into the inner sanctum. It wasn't the den of chaos he had expected. Instead, the room was eerily quiet, illuminated by a dozen glowing monitors that cast a sickly pale light over the man sitting behind a mahogany desk. Silas, the head of the Blackie Meade crew, didn't reach for a weapon. He simply leaned back, a thin, predatory smile stretching across a face that looked like etched parchment. He was old, far older than the rumors suggested, and his eyes held a terrifying clarity. "You're late, Kade," Silas said, his voice a dry rasp that carried over the fatting echoes of gunfire outside. "I expected you at the door 5 minutes ago. You're getting sentimental. It makes you slow." Kade kept his sights leveled at Silas's chest, his finger married to the trigger. "Where is the girl? Where is Agnes?" Silas chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering over stone. He didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward the monitors. On the screens, Kade saw his own men, Elias and Jax, moving through the warehouse, their movements tracked by thermal sensors he hadn't detected. They weren't in control, they were being herded. "There is no debt, Kade," Silas said softly. "Martha didn't owe us a cent. Agnes wasn't a pawn in a trade. They were just the cheese in a very old, very patient trap." The cold that settled in Kade's stomach had nothing to do with the warehouse air. He thought of the teddy bear, the coordinates, and the uniformed woman who had appeared so conveniently in his hour of grief. Every piece of the puzzle had been handed to him, shaped perfectly to fit the hole in his heart left by Alina. "You used her face," Kade hissed, his voice trembling with a lethal vibration. "You found Amari because she looked like my sister. I found a girl who needed a purpose and a man who needed a ghost to chase," Silas countered, standing up slowly. He spread his hands wide, defenseless yet untouchable. "I needed you out of your fortress, Kade. I needed you to burn your alliances and break your own code. Look at you. You've declared war on the city for a lie. You've brought your best men here to die for a memory." Kade's gaze flickered to the monitors. A group of Meade enforcers were closing in on Jax's position, weapons raised. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He hadn't been the hunter. He had been the one led to the slaughter, fueled by a grief that Silas had weaponized against him. "She's not here, is she?" Kade whispered. "Oh, Agnes is quite safe," Silas smiled, his eyes glinting with malice. "But you're exactly where I want you. Now let's see if the ghost of your sister can save you from the fire you started." The ride back to the estate was a blur of rain-slicked pavement and the heavy, rhythmic thrum of the engine. In the backseat, Agnes was a fragile shadow wrapped in Kade's oversized tactical jacket. She hadn't spoken since he pulled her from the soundproofed basement of the cannery, a room Silas had intended to be her tomb and Kade's final breaking point. She sat staring at the window, her small hand clutching the mangled teddy bear, its seams crudely stitched back together. Kade gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles bruised and his shoulder burning from the graze of a bullet. The trap had snapped shut, but Silas had underestimated one thing. A man who has already lost everything doesn't fear the fire. Kade had fought his way out not for glory or territory, but for the one thing Silas couldn't understand, the chance to finally finish a journey that had begun on a rainy curb 20 years ago. As the car crunched up the gravel driveway of the secluded estate, the front door swung open. The golden light from the foyer spilled onto the porch, framing Amari. She looked different now. The jagged edge of her exhaustion had been replaced by a raw, breathless anticipation. Kade killed the engine. The silence that followed was thick, charged with a tension that felt like the moment before a storm breaks. He got out and opened the rear door, offering a hand to the small girl inside. Agnes took it, her movements slow and hesitant, as if she were stepping into a world she no longer recognized. As they approached the porch, Amari collapsed to her knees, her breath hitching in a sob she had clearly been holding back since the night the windows shattered. Agnes let go of Kade's hand and ran, a small streak of gray against the dark night, throwing herself into Amari's arms. Kade stood at the base of the stairs, watching the two of them cling to each other. He saw the way Amari buried her face in the girl's hair, her shoulders shaking with the force of her relief. In the warm glow of the doorway, the resemblance to Alina was still there, but the ghost had finally lost its power to haunt him. Amari wasn't a memory. She was a living, breathing woman who had fought for her family, just as he had. He had burned his world to the ground to bring them here. His lieutenants were scattered, his peace was shattered, and Silas would be coming for blood. But as Kade watched the door slowly close, sealing the two of them safely inside the warmth of the house, he felt a strange, quiet peace. For the first time in 2 decades, he didn't feel like the boy who had let go. He stood in the rain, a sentinel in the dark, and finally let the memory of the red mitten fade away. Would you like me to write the final aftermath where Kade prepares for Silas's inevitable retaliation? The iron-bolted doors that had once served as the perimeter of a cage now felt like the threshold of something Kade didn't have a name for. He walked through the foyer, his boots tracking mud and dried blood onto the hardwood floors he had always kept meticulously, sterilely clean. Usually, the silence of the estate was a heavy, suffocating blanket, a reminder of everything he had lost and the isolation he had built to protect himself from losing it again. But tonight, the silence was gone. From the kitchen came the soft clink of a ceramic spoon against a bowl and the low, melodic hum of Amari's voice. It wasn't the jagged, panicked sound of the girl who had arrived at his door with a ghost's face. It was a rhythmic, soothing murmur that pulled at a string deep in Kade's chest. He paused in the doorway, his hand instinctively reaching for the holster at his hip, only to let it drop. Agnes was sitting at the heavy oak table, wrapped in a knitted blanket that had sat untouched in a hallway chest for years. She was eating a bowl of broth, her movements small and careful, while Amari sat beside her, carding her fingers through the girl's hair. The mangled teddy bear sat between them like a guest of honor. The air in the room didn't smell like gun oil or old paper. It smelled of vanilla and steam. "The perimeter is set," Kade said, his voice sounding unnervingly loud in the domestic warmth. "I have men at the gate. Silas won't be able to get within a mile of this place tonight." Amari looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. The resemblance to Alina was still a sharp ache, but for the first time it didn't feel like a wound. She saw the exhaustion etched into his features, the way he leaned against the doorframe as if the weight of the night were finally catching up to him. "Thank you, Kade," she said softly. She stood and walked toward him, placing a hand on his arm. Her touch was warm, grounding, and entirely real. "You should eat. You look like you're still standing in the rain." Kade looked around his fortress. He saw the scuff marks on the floor, the open cupboards, and the way Agnes looked at him, not with fear, but with a quiet, budding trust. He had built these walls to keep the world out, to ensure that nothing could ever be taken from him again. He had lived like a king in a tomb. But as he watched Amari pull out a chair for him, he realized the fortress had failed. Something had broken through the stone and the steel. Something vibrant and demanding had taken root in the ruins of his isolation. He wasn't just a guardian of a border or a boss of a crew anymore. He sat down at the table, the cold metal of his life giving way to the simple, terrifying warmth of a shared meal. He was no longer just protecting a secret. He was living in a home. Would you like me to write a final epilogue showing how Kade deals with the remaining threat of the Mead crew while maintaining this new life?